Welcome to Writing the Wrong Way, a podcast for readers who want something strange and exciting, and writers who need something new. If you want to support this podcast, please consider buying my new book, The National Gallery. I'm extremely proud of this book because it may be my best book, and it is certainly my most personal and heartfelt book. But just because I say it's heartfelt doesn't mean it isn't full of weirdness, like sonnets about Leatherface from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and elegies for my dead iPhone. For a limited time, if you buy a copy of the National Gallery directly from me, I will sign it, and I will also send you a signed copy of my previous book, The Politics of Knives, for no additional cost. So you can order the book and get your free book with it at thenationalgallery.ca. That's thenationalgallery.ca. I'm also excited because it is my 10-year anniversary as an author. My first book, Ex Machina, was published in October 2009, and to celebrate, now that it is 2019, as I record this, I've made Ex Machina available as an ebook for the first time. It was never available as an ebook previously, and I'm giving that ebook away for free at jonathanball.com/freebook. So go to jonathanball.com/freebook, and you can sign up, get all my exciting news when it's exciting and new, and other free resources that I'll just send you as I create them, plus a free book. And again, you can go to thenationalgallery.ca if you want to find out more about my new book and get a free book as well when you order that. So two free books and a paid book available to you. In any case, let's get into the show. So I'm here with Cam Scott, the author of Roman's Snowwear out of ARP Books. And Cam, I want to just, first off ask you about some of the influences behind this project. Because I read this book, we're sitting in Winnipeg here, and, you're kind of sometimes in Winnipeg, sometimes in New York, but I kind of met you here, and you grew up here, did you not?
I did.
Yeah. And so, but weirdly, I think both of us share a certain influence, maybe you a bit more so, of the Kootenai School of Writing, and particularly, there's a local poet, Colin Smith here, who was really integral to some of the work I did. My previous book, The Politics of Knives, had a lot of feedback from Colin, and he was really important in that work. And he's a figure associated or in the Kootenai School of Writing movement, which in Canada was at a particularly important historical poetry movement. Mm-hmm. And he is a person, Colin Smith, if you're listening, is a person who's kind of underappreciated in that whole movement. So that movement has a lot of great figures, some who are Lisa Robertson, one of my favorite writers, who's not super associated with that movement, but it does come out of it. Figures like Jeff Dirksen, who's very associated with that movement and a major figure in it as well. But then Colin Smith, to me, was the one who was doing the best work at the time, at least, and who his book Multiple Poses kind of suffered from a weird thing where the binding glue made the books. It was improperly manufactured, and the books started to fall apart. So it became kind of rare and hard to find, even within this realm of rare, hard to find, experimentalist work. And then additionally, he didn't really follow it up till, I forget when exactly, but 8x8x7 is his sort of follow-up book. Right now, if you're listening to this, you should go get a book called Multiple Bippies, which came out recently.
Yes.
Which kind of reprints a lot of Colin's earlier work and has a bunch of new work. But Colin Smith's work is really, something, and I can definitely see the influence of the KSW and Colin Smith, and maybe even figures like Jeff Dirksen and Roman Snowwear. So I'm just wondering if you could talk a bit about maybe that influence, or just how you kind of came, what's the sort of story in a nutshell of how you came to write this book, and some of the kind of key maybe influences on there, because I know that just having known you over the years, I know this has been a long time in the making of this particular book.
Yes, and that's a very collegial reading that I deeply appreciate, because the KSW, or at least the after image of the KSW, I think that today people will dispute how well it functions as a collective in the present, and I think a lot of people would tell you that its energies are somewhat dispersed. But the influence of the KSW was tremendous. And I mean, as I think a Canadian reply to a lot of language writing and new narrative. And I think you could even argue, it's tricky because jumping back and forth between the United States and Canada, I realize how incredibly salient and foreboding for some people that border is, that people in the United States do not read Canadian writing, that they should be, I don't know that I say should, maybe should is not the right word, but that I think they would thrill to if they knew it existed. And obviously the reverse is less true. But there's a West Coast axis, that is probably much more relevant an affinity than a Canadian or an American thing. I think the writing in Vancouver probably partook freely of Bay Area experimental writing. And there was a really lively interchange to a greater degree even than it was informed by what was going on in Eastern Canada. So there's a kind of an internationalism to the KSW. But
is that how you kind of got, did you kind of get into that work? When did you get into that kind of work? Did you, because I met Colin and I had kind of known what he was doing and stuff, and then I sort of later started to learn more about the KSW. Mm-hmm. So in a weird way, he was kind of my entrance into that. Absolutely. I didn't even know he was associated with it until later, after having known him for years.
Yeah, he's a modest guy. I think I was tangentially aware of some of the bigger names who kind of found their own, I don't want to say larger context, but someone like Lisa Robertson, who's more widely read, certainly than Colin. Who I realized the microphone wasn't picking up me nodding emphatically while you were speaking about Colin, but he's tremendous. I might have been aware of some discrete names, but I think the vibrancy of the collective, and that collectivity within which context I know Colin would insist that it's hard to cherry pick,
Sure.
Because he identifies with the collective, I think, so strongly, and in spite of which his writing is really, really, really singular and tremendous. So almost name for name, that stuff became very important to me. But Colin was feeding me books. We were hanging out, and he was introducing me to all kinds of writing that had been totally inaccessible to me, and that was hugely exciting. I think that the KSW, as a Canadian corollary of new narrative in particular, would have been a huge influence. And then Colin made really important introductions in my life as well to Kevin Killian and Dodie Bellamy and people doing kinds of experimental life writing that might, I think, inform the initial layers of Roman Snowmare more than almost anything.
Can you talk a bit about what Roman Snowmare is? Can you describe just how the book kind of works a little bit, and particularly how that Romans poem kind of moves throughout the book?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I'll start because I just mentioned Kevin Killian. I'll start with the title. I so loved Kevin's book Argento series, which is a wonderful, for the listener who isn't aware, book of poems commemorating, I would say, the AIDS dead. The author's immediate company, friends and lovers decimated by AIDS. It was written, I think, through the height of the plague years. And it's very tonally complicated because it's riotously funny and intertextual and draws in so much. It's the AIDS epidemic viewed through the prism of Dario Argento films. And it's such a complicated kind of elegy. I loved that book so much. And I was going to San Francisco and, requested an audience with Kevin Killian, and Colin Smith obliged me and put us in touch. And I went down there and I hung out with Kevin Killian and Dodie Bellamy, and we had a great weekend. And at the end of it, having hit it off, Kevin was like, "Oh, you should send me your writing." So I sent him this manuscript that I was working on that was called Roman Snowmare, and he wrote back to me, and he itemized the things he liked, and he was emphatic about what he didn't. And he said, Cameron can do better. I remember he said that. He used the full name, right? Cameron, not Cam. And I took that very seriously, and I appreciated his time. But he said, "I love the title." So I decided, okay, I'm going to throw out the entire project, and I'm going to keep the title. We're going to start from scratch with the title that has Kevin Killian's blessing. And that would have been in 2011. And very little of that first draft remained. What Roman Snowmare really is, it originates alongside a lot of research that I was doing into the basis for B.P. Nichols' life poem, The Martyrology, in his psychoanalytic training, and thinking about kind of seriality versus modularity, where big, sprawling, lifelong writing projects were concerned. I was comparing Robin Blaser's Holy Forest to B.P. Nichol, and I was thinking about Rachel Blau Duplessis and Ron Silliman and Louis Zukofsky, and people who write these enormous poems that are basically commensurate with the scale of a life. And I think because of the Prairie equivalents written by Robert Croce and Dennis Cooley and so on, great, sprawling, almost autoethnographical poems, I was thinking about how to embark on something on that scale. It's kind of like an interminable self-analysis almost. And at the same time, I was deeply blocked up in my own writing. And I had these notebooks upon notebooks, I think, as every writer does, of poem germs, little scraps of found language, sentences that I liked that occurred to me that I thought would instigate poems at a later date. And I was puzzling over this predicament, which is the feeling, I think this would be familiar to writers, that I was always writing and never writing, never realizing anything. So I decided executively to just collapse the distance between all of these discrete lines, written days, weeks, months apart from each other, and just try to vacuum pack the little poem germs comprising these notebooks. And the texture of the poem, I guess for those listening, Roman Snowmare is usually prose, and quite disjunctive prose. The texture of the poem derives from that operation, that I just thought that I would compile all the lines and see what sorts of repetitions and cross associations and rhythmical effects resulted. And I really liked the result. And the first layer of that is, I don't know on what page of this book, in the season of goose flesh and sweaters, every threshold is tested, is the first line of the first layer of what would become Roman Snowmare. And since then, somewhat executively, it's just become this experiment in large-scale and durational aggregation of text. I write a sentence, at least one sentence every day. I don't limit myself. If I want to write 3, I'll write 3. But the most compelling, sequences of sentences that seem very much to have to do with one another usually are written quite separately, and that's pure serendipity where the writing is concerned. So it's basically, it's just a project in daily writing and compiling when you have nothing to say.
How does it relate? Does it relate at all to your like your previous one of your bio in this book lists you as a non-musician, which I think is really funny because I first met Cam with through my friend who was in a band with him.
Yeah.
And this band, your band at the time was called Guns, Liquor, and Whores, but then you changed the name to Under Pressure. And I remember and you'd played in other bands as well. And Cam was the vocalist, lyricist, for that band and others. And so I'm wondering, to what degree does any of this have to do with your life in music?
More than I know, I'm sure. But it's interesting because I came up singing in and playing in a variety of punk bands.
Yeah, a lot of punk hardcore kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I feel for me, I kind of came up in grunge and metalish bands, but I was very much a punk sort of ethos, to what I was doing. I felt a lot, and I first started writing poetry and learning to write when I was writing. So I began writing as seriously after I had been transcribing, because back in the days of grunge or in high school, I would get cassettes and record things off the radio and from friends and stuff. So I would you'd get all these grunge songs and you wouldn't know what they were saying. You couldn't make out what they were saying, but you didn't have a lyric sheet. And so but I always wanted to know what they were saying. So I'd listen closely and I'd write down what they were saying, just to have my own little handwritten lyric sheet. And what happened was at a certain point, the internet comes in, or you can order a CD, because I was in a very small town, so there's no record stores or anything. But once in a while, I would order a CD through the mail or something, and eventually I'd get a hold of the real lyrics, and it was always massively different from what I thought they were saying. And what I noticed is at a certain point, there's certain moments where I liked my line better, the thing I thought they were saying better than what they were actually saying. And so I started just kind of from that writing alternate lyrics for songs, and then that kind of my kind of poetic practice sort of came out of mishearing grunge lyrics and hardcore punk songs and not really understanding what they were saying because they were shouting or screaming or mumbling or whatever. And so to me there's a really clean line from that whole style of music and the kind of surrealistic lyrical approach that you often have in that kind of music, and the kind of DIY or political ethos of it. To some degree. My work's not especially political, but once in a while it has that kind of weird elliptical fragmentary politics to it. And I see I can see that influence in a sense in what you're doing, but I wonder how much that is a thing you see or can trace through your development as a writer.
I see it more in retrospect, and when you describe those experiences, I think that it makes a lot of sense. First and foremost, that my politicization was absolutely within punk music, and I think that that's an important thread of this book, which, for a relatively opaque piece of writing, I hope still wears its kind of leftist political convictions on its sleeve. I don't know that books have sleeves, but on its spine. Yeah. And I might have answered that question at one point by being punk is at this point in my life not so much a rigidly demarcated genre as a portable ethic that you can take with you and apply to different pursuits and different mediums. And I think that's true. Definitely the ethos of not having participated in it, but having been inspired by it where we started, the ethos of the KSW, I'm not sure that it's so unrelated. It's a very, very
sure.
DIY
Still that anarcho DIY leftist
Yeah.
a collective approach.
And the idea that you have to create your own infrastructure somewhat. In terms of the manifest content of what I'm saying, I mean, certainly, there's a bit of an irony. You mentioned the first band I played in, we had just like...
Was that the first band you played in, Guns, Liquor, and Whores?
The first serious band.
Yeah.
And,
which was a straight edge band at the time.
It was.
Until Pat joined it.
And we changed the name because, it was a very juvenile, antagonistic posture. We weren't trying, I wish to take this opportunity to say, we weren't trying to shame anyone's sexuality.
Yeah.
We would not.
I remember you specifically changed it at the time to Under Pressure, like naming it after this Queen song.
Yeah.
I remember like being really interested in it at the time.
Which also happens to suit an angsty punk band, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And that was when we got really serious, On one hand, we had a sense that the stakes were elevated because we didn't want to have this unfortunate joke moniker. But also, we made a lot of records and we toured a lot. And I think that the lyrics at that point for me, I really did feel like it was a matter of life or death. But they, I think, evince a lot of the pitfalls of the genre. I love a lot of those songs, and also I listen to them, and it's this display of kind of, how to say, narcissistic self-loathing that's a staple of the genre.
It is a staple. I mean, the song Under Pressure is a great band, by the way. If people are listening and can get a hold of Under Pressure, I don't know where it's available or how it's available.
I think it's streaming.
I've got all the records and stuff,
Yeah.
but if it's streaming, you should definitely go check out Under Pressure because they were a great band. And the album that I was that I thought was a little, that my favorite song was the song "Come Clean," which is a really great track in a lot of respects. And but I can see what you're saying. So in some ways, when you come into this book and you're looking at the page, I guess it seems to me like on one hand you're pulling the influence of maybe some of that like musical influence, and then on the other hand you're moving away from like the limitations of the genre in a manner of speaking.
Well, what you pointed out, I hadn't thought about it until now, but the way that I wrote lyrics for that band, and certain of the affects that are woven into the title poem are identical. I haven't grown that much. Are identical to, I think, the manifest content of the Under Pressure songbook, as it were. I wrote the same way. I had notebooks that were just filled with sentences, a single line. And I would think, okay, well, when we have to record the song, when we have to actually have lyrics, I'll dig through the notebooks and I'll put something together. It's a lot more trepidatious doing a book, I think, than a band because it's a solitary endeavor. You don't have those people pushing you to completion, which is probably one of the reasons for the texture of the book. That it wound up being more diaristic because it's just a more solitary endeavor than songwriting collectively.
Did you find it hard to make that transition? Like, what to you is the hardest part of like putting a book together? Because this is your first book, which is a daunting thing for a lot of people, and like some people rush a first book out, and some people are slow to do their first book. So like you and I are both in the slow camp.
Yeah.
In the sense that we took a while to get it out. Like after having written for a long time, like. So I guess, like, did you ever feel like, for you, was it just a matter of, like, frustration that you weren't finished this book? It wasn't up to your standards? Or was there, like, some reason you were taking, did it just keep changing? Like, what was the sort of, what was it like to write the book in that sense, do you understand the question? Like,
yeah.
Like, for me, I was very particular, and I did a lot of stuff and threw out a lot of stuff, because I'd seen so many people put out a first book and then they were ashamed somehow of the first book. And like, I felt that, and for certain people I saw that was preventing them from doing a second book. So like, I made a very specific decision, like, I'm going to take it really slow. I'm gonna really do a lot of stuff before I get this book out. And and then my deal in my head was like, and by the time the book comes out, I want to have a second book accepted. So like I was very, kind of a weird combination of like slow, taking my time and rushing, but it was very particular for me. So I don't know. I'm curious to how you approached it. Like, were there like blocks that you had a hard time getting past, or
I wish I could say that I was always purposed at something like the artifact we have in front of us under discussion today. I had definitely, however, circulated a few years ago, I guess, some inferior versions, that were just thinner, that just had less to them. I mean, I recall that story of Kevin Killian saying Cameron can do better. I appreciate that kind of admonishment because this book, and this is a little different perhaps than your projects, which are, it strikes me, each of your books is very self-contained.
Yeah.
Is very complete, and even your most recent, which is the most like a collection that you've done, is very thematically contained, and whereas this book is sort of a few threads that could have been separate books. And at one time I envisioned them. The Unsummoned is a long kind of anti-travelogue, and I'd envisioned that as a separate project from Roman Snowmare. And it sort of came to me gradually that these things benefit from being placed in proximity to each other.
How did it feel when you got that comment? Because Gregory's walking around in the background here, and me and him earlier today we were talking about like how on one hand as a writer you need like this belief and this vision in what you're doing that you have to be able to like work through, and despite criticism. But on the other hand, you can't really get better unless you can accept criticism. Like you have to have a weird, you have to hit a weird position where you are attached to the work and it matters to you, but also you can disconnect enough to understand like that outside point of view. So it's like a weird thing where you have to like basically learn to take people just like criticizing the work and like take it, like it has to be personal to you, but you have to not take it personally in a strange way. I'm just wondering like how did you like learn to do that? Because some people, what they'll do when they get remarks like that, especially by somebody that like they admire, is they'll just be crushed and they'll destroy them. They'll quit. They'll throw the thing away and they'll never come back to it. And other people like, maybe they feel like that here and there, but they kind of manage to, accept it and understand where it's coming from and, and move forward with it. I'm just curious, how did you manage to view that in like the right way versus like, how sometimes people can take like that, can just like that same comment could have like totally destroyed you in this project if you were just thinking about it a different way. It's like, I guess my question, because I always struggle with this, is like people sometimes, I don't know how to like advise people about this sometimes, because they'll be like, well, like a lot of times I'm trying to give advice to people and it's like, well, I don't even understand the question, because like I would never have done this. Like I would never react that way. And so I don't know how to explain to you that you shouldn't react that way. But it's not that you're wrong, like to have that reaction necessarily. Like, so I'm curious to know, like when you got that kind of comment, like what was your initial reaction?
I'm thinking back. Do you know?
Like, do you remember like the process of like how you moved to like forward with the project at that point, rather than say abandoning it? Because you did you threw out a bunch of it, you said, but like.
I think that the thing that would potentially have been devastating, that in this case, sort of furnished the writing this very productive. The traction of identification, with the person administering the critique. In this case, Kevin. I loved his writing, and he was. I should say, actually, because I was recommending his books earlier, that when I'm speaking of Kevin in this in this interview, always the book is dedicated to him. He passed away earlier this summer, quite suddenly, and I think a whole world of queer experimental writing is really reeling from that passing. But one thing that Kevin was so expert about, he was such a consummate supporter of everybody. So I think partly it has to do with his manner. He administered the critique just so. You know, he didn't say this is a disaster. He said do better, you know, which I felt like I had to live up to the advice. You know, I couldn't simply narcissistically despair of the writing altogether, because that would have been self-protective in some way too. You know, to give up on something is to despair totally, and to not be able to dwell in the uncertainty of the uncertainty of being midway through a creative project, and also not being able to dwell in basically adequacy to one's own design. I'm not very precious about it too, is maybe another thing to say.
Were you ever precious about it? Like, is that something you had to get over, or was it just you never? Never really worked.
I don't think so. I'll credit this to punk too. You know, is I always had this idea that it's good and valuable to be making things so that you can see yourself on however modest a scale reflected in the world around you. You know, that you can exert this minimal agency over this minimal agency within the context of a little microculture that you belong to, you know? And I always was very happy to toil in community with, I think, the goal of, with some pretty modest goals ultimately in mind. But that's the key word. Well, why was it not devastating? If you're accepting critique in a collegial fashion from people you admire, who, if you sincerely believe that they care about your project, that's real. I was so flattered by the interest that Kevin had. He didn't need to read it. Colin Smith was the first reader of the poem that became The Unsummoned, I said as a thread in this book. And it was just exciting to be working something out in conversation with them, you know?
Colin gave me a great piece. In Politics and Knives, this poem called Psycho, which is about Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. And it ends with one of the last things in Psycho is, Perkins's character has him taken over by the mother personality, and he's thinking in this interior monologue, he sees a fly, and he's like, I'm not even going to swat that fly. And they'll watch me and they'll say, why, she wouldn't even hurt a fly. And I had a line kind of mirroring that, and Colin had suggested, he was like, I see what you're doing with all this, but why not make it a question? Why would we even harm a fly? And now pull it into the weird realm of a strange, almost ethical question of why, do humans do anything harmful in this world, and that widening out, almost, because it's very as you were saying before, my books are very insular projects, and even within those they'll have these very insular sections, and they're very self-contained. I'll have certain things that kind of go across the books or across sections in the books, but then even those moments are really specific, and but I like it. To me, it was so his suggestion, they've kind of take that moment, and without kind of ruining what I was doing, start widening it out and suggesting giving a suggestions beyond this I don't know what this kind of insularity. I found that commentary sometimes, it's just it's not the way you think sometimes, right? And so it's like you need sometimes just that friction of this other way of thinking that you can't necessarily get when you're just kind of in your head, especially if your work is designed, but from a person who say they understand what you're doing. Like that's the thing I thought was like Colin has a long history of editing and so on, and he has. I just thought it was a very insightful and incisive kind of moment, and I could see instantly, oh, okay, I see exactly like how he gets what I'm doing, and he's just kind of grabbing literally at the last line, start like broadening it a bit, so it doesn't like ruin or touch what you already were doing, but it starts to like give this greater resonance to everything. Plus it is a question mark, which it sounds weird, but like I don't use a lot of question marks. Even when it's a question, I won't put a question mark a lot of the times. And so like it has all sorts of like these weird I don't know, it's just a really brilliant little comment. And I find like it's sometimes hard when you get like comments like that, because it's not how you would do it. But then like sometimes like that's what you need, is like to kind of break out of your style a little bit. I find it's such a weird, I don't know, what's your thought on this? Like I find like as a writer, it's so hard to get to your style, and you like work so hard to develop a style, and then once you develop that style, you have to start figuring out how to break out of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like what are you going to do next, I guess, is like kind of what it leads into. Like where are you at now that you've finished this book and it's out and it's here? Like where are you at now, and like are you thinking about what you're doing now in relation to this at all? Like, because some people they just kind of pursue a set of obsessions throughout their writing life. Some people just like move from project to project, and they're just developing a style. And other people like me are just like, they're doing projects, and they kind of have to reinvent a new style for each project.
Mm-hmm.
It's not necessarily the best way to work.
It sounds arduous.
Yeah, it is. But and it's not like, and it's actually in many ways it's worse idea.
Yeah.
But like even like artistically, it arguably is a worse idea, because you're not building a body of the work in a direction in the same way.
Yeah.
But it's just a different way to work things. I guess I'm kind of curious to know what. Every time I see somebody put a book out, I always think, I'm curious what their second book's going to be.
Well, that's so tricky,
idea,
because
like where you're moving with it.
There's a level on which, though this book collects writing going back as far as maybe 10 years.
Sure.
The next book could simply be Roman Snowmare, because I and as a courtesy to ARP, who need to market this saleable object called Roman Snowmare, I will not call it that. But
that'd be kind of interesting. I've always wanted to do something like that. Like 10 books with the same title.
The original, because this is the idea, is that every poem, and it's sort of arbitrary, it might be a section of a notebook. Mm-hmm. Normally the logic behind the demarcations, why is this prose block Romans, why does it begin and end here? It really is as simple as, well, the notebook breaks off, I had to write down a bunch of phone numbers or something, and it'll pick up elsewhere. But every poem in that sequence is called either Romans or Snowmare. And in the version that I submitted to Kevin's attention in the first place, that had a very, very clear logic. The near anagram, Roman like novel. It was supposed to be a kind of novelistic layer. And then there was going to be this kind of dreamlike obverse, almost a shadow of the other text. So the name had this very literal significance. And I liked.
Was it just too clean? Was it too?
Well, and I liked Roman Snowmare. He was like, I love the title is this near anagram, and I felt like he got it. This returns to what I was saying. It's easy, and it's even flattering to accept criticism from people who get it.
Yeah, sure.
And can even advance your project in ways that you wouldn't have thought. He's like, it's a near anagram, but there's kind of a material remainder, like sounds, but there's these leftover undigestible letters. And then in the present version, I was really interested in Snowmare as it's kind of the unconscious driver of the project, you know? It's really not that this layer corresponds to my dream journaling and this layer corresponds to quotidian incident. It's that one is always backed with the other, and the naming is a little bit arbitrary because every section weaves those together. I'm a little off topic. I work on the poem every day, you know, as I said. It was my solution to having a poor work ethic and no project. I'm nothing if not motivated because now I have a project that is potentially commensurate with my
I think that's one of the most, you know, useful things to do as a writer is to figure out like how it is it that I work. Like, because I think often as a writer you hear about other people and how they work, and you think, well, I should do that, or I should, you know. And sometimes it's a good idea, and sometimes it doesn't work for you for whatever reason.
Yeah.
You know, and like I find often there's like an idea in your head about what like a writer should be, and then there's like the thing you're doing, and it can never really fully match that writer you think you should be often. And I think like a lot of the times it's like people try to close the gap. And I think like what's maybe more valuable is to figure out like what's interesting in the gap. Like and like what I started doing when I started to really move forward as a writer was when I started just figuring out like if I just had an architecture of a project that would allow me to put things inside of it, then I could like put anything inside of it. Like and as long as it like fit in this architecture, it would work. And that would allow me to do all these different things. So I was always interested in doing a lot of different things. And so what I eventually figured out was, as I was doing writing all the time, but I was never completing anything. And what I eventually figured out was if I just can conceive of a complicated but very concise architecture for a book, then I can really fill that with madness. And it can be you know, and then it starts to just become a tension. A thing where I'm just managing a tension between like having a very specific cathedrally constructed like tight structure, and then like inside of it I can just trying to just break it apart and go wild. Like it's like I'll write a sonnet, but then I'll make it about Leatherface, and like it won't even have words in it anymore. You know, like I'll just at one point one of my sonnets about Leatherface is just, instead of 14 lines, it's a line and a half, and it's a quote from Shakespeare. I didn't write any of the words, you know, and like, but it's still like laid on the page. Like I laid it out, you know, to accord with how these, like the facing page has 14 lines, and it's like in this particular position, and it's positioned exactly how like the text would be in the Shakespeare, you know, edition, and it thematically is about the same thing, you know. So like to me it becomes very much about this kind of weird tension management. If you can figure out again like just the structure inside which you can work, and now it's bounded, you know, like you know when you're done, like, you know, like I'll decide I'm going to write, you know, about the group of 7. Well, you know, there's this many members of the group of 7, and I can write a poem for each. They don't have to be about the group of 7.
Well, you added some extra ones.
Well, those are all the people associated with the group of 7, right?
Yeah.
But like, that was the thing that I liked, is like group of 7. You look them up, it's like, well, there's 12 members of the group of 7, and I was like, okay, like that's right in my alley, you know, like this weird, you know, almost like it's a structure, but it's also got an arbitrary aspect to it. And I think like that kind of, to me, like writing is all about managing those weird tensions. And anyway, what I like about what you're talking about is like you got like this, again, the idea of like the B.P. Nichols-esque like martyrology, like this like lifelong poem that, again, like you could carry from book to book, but at the same time, like it has this madcap nature, you know. And Nichols is, you know, and then, you know, to pull in the KSW influence, like just this really, I don't know, I just want to pull a particular moment.
Yeah, of course.
So you've got like this page, "The After Party" is the name of the poem, but you know, you have this great line in here. If you've got beef, milk it to stringency. I love, if you love architecture, you have ghosts. You know, like I'm curious, like, about, like, so one of the things that you're doing in those lines or in general is you're really using like those line breaks, those enjambments,
Yeah.
you know, in an interesting way. So like I see that, but like if you got, I'm curious about a line like that. So if you've got beef, milk it to stringency. like to me, that's a brilliant line for so many reasons. One, you've got like these different meanings of the word beef, you know, right? Like you've got like, you know, got beef, like the old, political saying that became kind of an coming from an advertisement. So like you pull in these two realms of like the like capitalist infiltration of, you know, political culture on one and pop culture. You've got like just how rappers use the word beef. You've got like this contestation with another person. You can milk that, you know, for your own purposes, or even like you've got the weird like beef and milk, you know, as foods. You know, it's such a weird. There's all just weird ways like the lines work, and they're very funny and strange, and like stringency, like the idea that you've got this beef that has like this texture, you know. Yeah,
it's a little
I'm curious.
gross,
So can you talk about that? Do you remember like when you wrote that line, or how you wrote that line?
I mean, I do somewhat. I mean, definitely a lot of this proceeds by. It proceeds sloganistically, you know. I'm attracted to the slogans and little bits of kind of indelible speech that, you know.
Why is that? What do you like about
your brain?
That kind of?
I mean, I think that on one hand they are imbued with this kind of underrated poeticity that is just almost a structure of thought that everybody takes for granted. You know, they're incredible. I mean, this not. Cynically, I like the sounds of a lot of them. I notice people always, and obviously these reference points change micro-generationally, but one thing that I'm really fascinated by that I think is maybe part of the pulse of the whole poem is I'm really, really fascinated by the kind of sonic underpinnings of thought and of conceptuality, like the way that people think after the fashion of metrical ready-mades and are attracted to grammatical parallelism and so on. And so often we find ourselves actually speaking and thinking and formulating ideas after the fashion of advertising slogans. Just that's one mode in which all of our thoughts are kind of, if not collective, secondhand, you know? And I'm also attracted to the cheapness of it.
Yeah, well, I think it's a great line because there's like a cheapness and a silliness to it. But it also, like, if you actually sit there and think about the possible meanings the line could have, it operates in this weird, dense way. Like, it's a very light, tossed-off line that you could easily overlook, but I think it has, like, this density to it, weirdly. Like, if you actually start thinking through which, of course, like, nobody would do. Well, but, like I started doing
except
it.
You now.
Which, yeah, like, I think, like, it's a kind of, I'm really attracted to that sort of thing. But even just, like you say, like, just words. Like I've been trying it reminds me of, like, I've been trying for years, at least, 3, 4, 5 years, to get the word fleek into a poem. Like on fleek, and I finally did it in National Gallery. But that's like, I mean, again, almost no one's going to notice that. But like, I've been trying to like get the word fleek to work in a poem forever, and like that's literally the impetus for writing a poem. Sometimes to me is like, can I get fleek in here?
Yeah.
And there's no reason for it other than I like how it sounds. I like this weirdness of junk culture, like crashing against like in this. My example, I put it in like a Rilke-inspired poem, but then in the poem is also about, so it's like this very high arch, like, tradition of, male romanticism in poetry, then crash against like this thing like some, like young black woman on YouTube said once. And then at the same time, it's got like this, and then I'm doing it inside of a poem that's like an elegy, but for a dead phone, like, so like I like those tensions a lot.
I think that so much poetry is, mind you, not very much that I read or am terribly interested in, so I think it's weird to even evoke it antagonistically or for my own kinds of comparative rhetorical purposes. But let's say so much poetry is really guarded against the everyday, even in, or this is the paradox that I think can be fatal. Even insofar as it's supposed to be very occasional and companionable and so on, but there are whole vocabularies that you just don't, that it doesn't admit of. There's kind of a strategic unconcern for the actual like lexical matter of everyday
like
life.
some people write a poem about working in their garden, what they realized about life, but they won't mention like the brand of the garden gloves.
Like
that's to me like the thing that I don't, or like what type of manure do they buy at the store? Like,
totally. And I mean, I think it has to do with a kind of romantic obfuscation of, well, like a kind of obvious commodification that I understand why somebody might think that there's like a lyric impetus to poetry that is in contradiction to the logic of the commodity form or something. But I'm not so interested in the kind of romantic anti-capitalism that's just about a sort of a retreat into rusticity and pure use value that doesn't admit of the commercial and the commodified. I think you have to traverse that material.
Like, I feel like the lie of poetry, of this kind of romantic lyricism in poetry, is that it is an anti-capitalist approach. Whereas I think what poetry needs to contend with is the fact that like romantic lyricism is how we've managed to take our emotional life and sell it. And represent it in a saleable object that now we can build a career from and so on. And like I think like it's fine for poetry to do that on some level, but it should acknowledge and be interested in it. If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, so I'm really interested in, personally, I'm really interested in I'm really interested in the forms of language that have a hollowness to them, if that makes sense. Particularly like I'm really interested in religious language, but as an atheist, like I really love spiritual psalms and like I really love like religious poetry, but I have no belief in that at all, and I like the form of it as a sort of weird, empty and hollowed thing, but that still retains like a weird, I don't know, like superstitious magic to me, but I feel like I can't like use it without somehow filling it up with like a skepticism, if that makes sense, or like, but one that isn't just cynical. And so like what I like about the kind of approach that you've got in this book is you've got, you'll write about like sitting on the bus, and like it's just it kind of walks that weird line between like a lyricism, and just kind of discussing the emotional experience of traveling on the bus, say, but then you'll kind of acknowledge like certain like the weird way in which you're inside of these structures, and literally being carried along by these structures, and at the same time the language is sort of doing that on one level to that image of you in the poem. So I like that it's not like a heavy-handed self-awareness, but I like how like you've got that kind of I don't know, like that I don't know what the best way to phrase it is, but you know what I'm saying, like it's kind of the poetry is very aware of itself as a thing, and is kind of drawing attention to itself as a thing, but at the same time it's operating like it's very well crafted. It's operating like with these very metrical qualities at times, or these very, you've got a lot of assonance, or like these very like traditional craft qualities. Like it doesn't look like normal poetry in a manner, like conventional poetry, but it has a lot of the same sonic qualities at times. Like I find that's a hard line to walk, just because I know that like when I try to do it, it's tricky.
Yeah, I'm glad. I mean, I'm glad to hear it. Well, to just backtrack one point, because I'm thankful for that observation. I think that's maybe one thing that I'm interested in. The poem's ability to realize uniquely as a kind of writing that a lot of people are a little bit suspicious of, is that it evinces this like surfeit of form to a lot of people's thinking, that it's just, that it's irksome to people in its artifice, and I think that's really actually very valuable, that it's already seemingly a degree further removed from a kind of naturalistic, how to say, that
it's artificial, as you say, like it's more obviously artificial. I'm really like, I find that that's in some ways the obvious artificial nature of it. I think gives you this weird opportunity to just point out how artificial normal language is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's why it's really inviting of all kinds of bizarre instances of speech that are themselves really, incredibly stylized, but according to different conventions, and you can put it all together in a poem in a way that's every line seems to alienate every other line. I think that's really, really a valuable opportunity. I think it's a special. I think it's. This is not like toward a grand theory of the poem, because I don't have one and I'm really not interested in that. I think that wouldn't be productive. But I'm interested in the poetry as an instance of speech that alienates whatever its content might be, And I think that's great for purposes of ideology critique, and I think that is also great even on the level of cultivating a certain kind of intentionality toward your surroundings. If you're reading the bus, if you're riding the bus, I like that slip, reading the bus. If you're a poet, maybe you're reading the bus. But I really like that reading, that maybe the poem is kind of structurally eccentric of itself or something.
Yeah, well, I like that there's the play and the density at the same time. Like, I think a lot of times people feel like they can either be dense or they can be playful, as opposed to, looking at instances of language like a pun in an advertisement, where you are really accomplishing both things and kind of taking that, idea into poetry. I think that's something the KSW is so great at. Was like, yes. And it's the kind of thing I see, you doing in the book, especially at moments like that, that beef line that I really like. But so like I appreciate that kind of that kind of tension between like a density and a playfulness, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, I think that's the other thing too, is that humor is kind of forbade from poetry, but all of my first fondest associations with poetry, and this is probably true for anybody. I worked in a children's bookstore for more than a decade, so I always was reading loads of poetry ostensibly written for children too, even over the course of my adult life. But my first associations with poetry have to do with silliness. Actually, not even humor, but silliness. I mean, like you know, the idea that it proceeds on the pleasure principle in some way, and that it's supposed to give pleasure and be pleasurable, and yeah, that's it too, as a pleasurable instance of speech. And that instantly contradicts, I think, you know, most people's kind of prejudicial distance from poetry as something that's very self-serious and this supposedly rarefied cultural activity. That, you know, I think it's I think it's an instance of speech too where you know, a quite unprecedented degree of playfulness is permitted, and the fact that the fact that there's all these popular associations with it that tend instead toward pathos, I don't know, that's hopefully a tension that I navigate in a way that doesn't seem like merely ironic.
Well, thanks so much for talking to me. And again, people can check out Cam's new book, his debut, Romans/Snowmare. Snowmare. Great little object by ARP Books. Really beautiful design and really, you know, yeah, great, dense, fun, interesting poems that combine all sorts of, you know, fascinating influences. So thanks so much again for talking to me.
Oh, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.